Philadelphia is steep in broadcast history. From the early pioneering days of broadcasting in the 1920s to today, Philadelphia has always been at the forefront. The Delaware Valley has been home to some of the best local programming in the country, starting with the early soap operas and children's shows to pioneering the best news formats in the country. Much of it all began right here. From radio announcers to television personalities, cameramen to directors, these were the broadcasters that burned out the airwaves. These were the pioneers of Philadelphia broadcasting.
Marciarose Shestak, how long has it been since you've been on Channel 3 giving people the news in Philadelphia?
Oh, a long time since I was actively doing it, but I was back about 10 years ago. Well, it was for the 40th anniversary, and I guested on the noon news, and I did the news, and somebody said to me, maybe it was Pat Schrock, he said, are things different than when you were there? And there were people behind the cameras then. I mean, it's the robotics just absolutely amazed me.
But it's at the base of it, it's still the same business, isn't it?
I don't know, is it, Rob? I don't know if it's still the same business. I think that when we did it, I hate sounding like a dinosaur.
Go ahead.
When we did it, we cared about our craft, we cared about what we did, and we cared about journalism. And our job was doing the news show. These kids have to do Twitter, have to do Facebook, have to blog, and do the news. I mean, that's a pretty tough assignment.
And in some markets, they're taking their own pictures.
Oh, no. Are they really?
Carrying cameras.
Where's the union?
What do you miss most about those days in 1965, 66, 67, the glory days of eyewitness news with Marciarose, Tom Snyder, George Caldwell? Tell me about those days. How exciting was it?
Well, it was really very heady, and it was exciting, but we didn't take ourselves seriously. I mean, I was the only woman. I ultimately became the first woman in America to anchor primetime news. I was the only woman in the newsroom and in the market for a while, and people were thinking, that it must be tough competing with the guys. I never competed with them. I mean, a lot of you all became friends, which was lovely. It sounds so goody two-shoes, but I was there to do a job, and I did my job, and I loved my job. And Tom and I had a very special kind of sparring relationship. And it was fun coming to work. And it was always just a little bit scary before the red light went on, those first seconds before the red light went on, and you had all those butterflies and the red light went on, and it was fun. I remember in New York, when I was working for NBC in New York subsequently, I interviewed Helen Hayes, the great actress Helen Hayes, and I asked her about butterflies, and if she, after all these years, she certainly still didn't have butterflies. And she said, if I didn't have butterflies, I'd stop acting. She said, you need those butterflies to get everything all revved up.
Well, when they told me I was going to interview you, I got butterflies because I was your copy boy for a number of years. And handing you your scripts and just counting myself very lucky that I was sharing the same room, the same studio with Tom Snyder, Vince Leonard, Marciarose, or as I got to know you, MR, as you were known in the newsroom.
Right.
And that's part of what it was. We all became friends there. We were more than colleagues.
We were. It was a very special time, and it was one of the glory days. I mean, they really were. I'm sure there was backstabbing and stuff like that went on, but essentially, I mean, I was just talking to Trudy Haynes, and Trudy had a tough time in that newsroom. The guys were not very welcoming and not very helpful at first.
And a lot of those guys were former newspaper guys, so they were really tough.
Well, you know why they were tough? They were tough because as newspapermen, they knew what they were doing, and they had to get out a paper every day, and they, the difference for me, I came to the newsroom having done, I was doing documentaries. Now in documentaries, what you're trying to do is to learn all you can learn about a subject and then tell it to your audience so that they'll know. In the news, you learn all you can know about a subject and then you start throwing things out because you only have a finite 25 seconds or 40 seconds to tell a story. And so you're very careful because you can err by omission as well as by commission.
One of the things we pride ourselves in the television business is our war stories. Do you have any war stories that you always tell people when they say, oh, Eyewitness News in the 60s? I mean, that was such a fun time, and we got it, you know?
Well, you know, the war story I tell mostly is how I almost didn't do the news. I was doing documentaries, I was doing talk shows. I wanted to do the news. We had, I don't know if you remember him, we had a general manager by the name of Ray Wellpop. And I went to him and I said, I'd like to do the news. And he laughed at me and he said, women will never do news. He said, they're not authority figures and they don't have good voices. End of story. And then 2 years later, he left and they decided to do a news program. They never talked to me. They had people come down from New York, actresses and Betty Furness and really some top flight people who auditioned for the show. And then one day they came to me and said, well, you're going to do the news and you're going to do it with a guy named Tom Snyder. He was then in Cleveland. And that was it. And you know, it was an amazing time. I remember that the Mike Douglas show followed us, and they were very worried about us because they had never been preceded by a news show, and they thought it was dull, and you know, it's the lead-ins in television that are very important, and they were very worried about us. After about 6 months, it gave us great pleasure. They came and asked us if we would promote them. So that was a great.
So who had the last laugh?
Yeah, that was a great thing.
And speaking about laughs, Tom Snyder was a real person, a real presence, I should say, in the newsroom. And he was a lot of fun, and he did a lot of crazy things when he was there.
Do you remember some of the crazy things?
I do remember one in particular. I'll see if you remember it. The news director had a birthday, Tom Bryson, and everybody in the newsroom was there to sing him happy birthday. And at the end of it, Snyder picked up a plate of spaghetti, hot, warm spaghetti in Pete Jacobus's plate, and proceeded to put it on top of Tom Bryson's head.
That's Tom. That sounds like
That's
that.
right. And he goes, oh, ha, ha, and looks around the newsroom, and everyone's like this, horrified. But he loved it.
Tom was one of the smartest men I ever worked with, and one of the toughest. I mean, he was really tough, and but he really prepared. He really knew what he was going to do, and it was interesting. My parents, who lived in New York, had a kind of a little shanty somewhere in New Jersey. And they put the biggest, tallest antenna on the roof that they could find so they could pull in Channel 3. And when Tom and I started doing the news, it was the Eyewitness News with Tom Snyder and Marciarose. Well, my parents said, why wasn't it with Marciarose and Tom Snyder? And I said, because I didn't care, and Tom wouldn't have gone on the air that way. I mean, he was very, very aware of his prerogatives, and he would not have. We were interviewing, I used to do these little interviews in the course of the show, and I was interviewing Sammy Davis Jr. Well, Tom was livid to think that I was going to do Sammy, and he wasn't. So I remember, as we went into, I said, Tom, come on in, talk to. So we did the three, because it didn't matter to me, and I think that's why it worked. All of it worked, because you can't be worried about those things all the time.
And it works so well that even today, you walk down the streets of Philadelphia and people still recognize and say hello to Marciarose.
They do, and it's very heartwarming. I would come home to my husband and I would say, somebody recognized me on the street today, and he said, were they 94?
What do you hope people remember about Marciarose Shestak?
They won't remember. They won't remember Marciarose Shestak. They'll remember Marciarose. And I'll tell you a story. After I stopped doing the news, I became president of the Philadelphia Developers Alliance, and the Business Journal came to interview me, and they said, "What do you see as the biggest difference between business and television?" And I said, "Well, I discovered I had a last name." Because when I first started, everything had to be very, it was very cut, very clean, no ethnicity at all. And Marciarose Shestak, they said, first of all, no announcer can say that. You can't even say it. So would you like to have another name? And I said, no, that was my name. I said, well, why don't we make it Marcia Rose? And I said, no. I didn't know, that wasn't my name. And they said, well, how about Marciarose? And I thought it was a little pretentious, but that was okay. That was the day of Liberace and Hildegard and Marcia Rose. And it's so no last name for a long time. But then when I was working, I was being considered for my job at NBC in New York, and I sent the program manager up my video, and months went by and I never heard from him. And one day, the general manager, who had been here in Philadelphia and was a friend, wondered why nothing had happened. And I said, so he talked to Roger LeMay. The next day, I get a phone call from him. And he said, come on up and let's have lunch. And he put me on the air the next week. And I said, well, what happened all this while? He said, well, I couldn't bear watching anybody who only had a first name. Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. What about, I guess one of the things you're really well known for was the time when you were pregnant and we had
Jennifer on the air.
Yes.
Well,
I mean, that was pretty personal stuff in those days.
The program manager took me to lunch. I had become pregnant, and it happens. And at that time, our ratings were pretty good, and they were not very happy about it. And he took me to lunch at what used to be Helen Siegel Wilson's.
Sure.
And we had a lovely, very pleasant lunch. And there were about 5 more minutes left before I knew we had to get back to the studio. And so I said, okay, what's this all about? And he said, well, you're pregnant, would you consider doing a program about your pregnancy? And I said, sure, I'd be glad to. And he said, it was kind of like making a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And so we did. I guess it was the last period of time, we did pregnancy features all the time. And we talked about health, and we talked about weight, and we talked about food. And finally, the doctor said I shouldn't be on the air anymore. And the station said, look, we'll boil water in the newsroom. Just stay on to the last one. And so I did. I did my last show and then went off and had the baby.
And I presume it was a ratings hit.
The ratings went through the roof. I mean, it was amazing. And people would stop me and they would say, years later, and say, we had our baby along with you, and how is Jennifer? And it was wonderful.
And that's probably one of the reasons why people still to this day say,
yeah.
Hello, Marciarose, how you doing?
And they took out a big ad, and they said, KYW is having a baby. And at that time, my co-anchor was George Caldwell.
Sure.
And so it was a picture of George and a picture of me.
Uh-oh.
And my husband, Jerry Shestak, said, wait a minute. Yeah.
I had something to do with this.
Yeah.
Looking back, what do you think? Pretty good run?
Oh, I think it was a wonderful run. Don't you feel that? How do you feel? Was it a wonderful run, Ralph?
I wouldn't trade it for $1 million.
No, because you made terrific contributions in the stuff you did. And you did good stories, and you introduced our audience to people they wouldn't have known about otherwise, even while you were doing news stories. I think it was a pretty good run. And what I don't understand and cannot believe is that it was 50 years ago. I mean, that
does sneak up on you, doesn't it?
Boy, it really does. I mean, 20 years ago, maybe 25, 30 at the most.
Yeah. Do you still watch Channel 3?
I really do. They've been wonderful to me, and I feel a great loyalty to Channel 3 and to CBS, and I think they do a terrific job. And I like the team, and that's what I watch.
Now,
what
I know
about you?
Everybody else in Philadelphia always turns to Channel 3 when they want to watch NBC these days, and they turn to Channel 10 when they want to watch CBS. It's been flipped. Do you still do that?
Not anymore, but at first it drove me crazy. And what was worse was when I went to New York, and I was working for NBC in New York, which was Channel 4.
Right.
And I would sign off and I would say, well, thank you so much for watching Channel 3. We'll see you again tomorrow. It becomes ingrained, and you don't remember it.
I know you talked to Al Primo earlier.
Yeah.
What was it like working with him?
He was also tough. I mean, he was very brash, and but look, he revolutionized the business for us, didn't he? Really? I mean, you used to go out and when you started reporting, you did a story, you wrote it up, and you gave it to the anchor person to do. Now suddenly, you were a star.
Mm-hmm.
You went out, you did the story, and you told people the story. I mean, it changed television news forever.
And he had to be a pretty confident guy to sell that to management, didn't he? Because
cocky.
first of all, it probably cost a heck of a lot more money with
No,
crews.
he told me.
Yeah,
Well, crews, yes, but the reason he used you was he didn't have to pay you anything more. I mean, he just told me that, which was fascinating.
yeah, the little loophole in the after contract.
That's exactly right.
The loophole.
It's always the bottom line.
And that's how brilliant ideas happen.
They do.
Somebody had a brilliant idea when they hired you.
What a way to end. Thank you so much, Rob.